The first thing I saw when I came home wasn't my house. It was a bulldozer. Actually, there were two of them. They were tearing through the eastern field of my family's farm. Trees were being ripped from the ground. Fence posts were scattered across the dirt. And where my grandfather had once grown corn, construction crews were preparing the land for something I had never approved. I slammed my truck into park. For several seconds, I couldn't move. Then I saw the sign. I stepped out of my truck. Someone was building a neighborhood on my family's land. And they had already started destroying it. Field. One of the bulldozers had just pushed through the old cedar fence. That fence had been there longer than I had. My grandfather built it by hand. I remembered helping him replace boards when I was a kid. He would work from sunrise until sunset, then sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and look across the fields. Now half of it was lying in the mud. I picked up one of the broken cedar posts. The wood was cracked. But I could still see the old nail holes where my grandfather had repaired it years ago. That was the moment the shock turned into anger. I walked toward the nearest construction worker. "Who authorized this?" The man looked at me. Then he pointed toward the construction trailer. "Talk to the HOA." I walked over to the construction trailer. A development map was taped across one wall. I stared at it. The farm had been divided into residential lots. Roads crossed the fields. New houses were marked along the property line. And the eastern section of my family's farm was labeled Maple Hollow Estates, Phase 2. I pulled out my phone and photographed the map. The boundary line was completely different from what I remembered. But I didn't yet know how different. I only knew one thing. They weren't planning to take a small corner of my property. They were planning to take acres. I drove straight to the Maple Hollow clubhouse. Beth Chambers was waiting for me. She looked exactly like someone who had never been told no. Perfect suit. Designer watch. Perfect hair. I walked through the doors covered in dust. "You need to stop construction." She barely looked up. "Daniel, you're misunderstanding the situation. You just bulldozed my farm. The property was incorporated into the development plan months ago. I never sold it." Beth smiled. "The developer acquired the necessary land." I stared at her. The next morning, I found a letter taped to my front door. It wasn't a request. It was a warning. The HOA ordered me to stop interfering with construction. They claimed the eastern portion of my farm was now association property. Then came the threat. If I obstructed construction again, I could face legal action. I took the letter inside. Placed it on the kitchen table. And read it again. Then I noticed the date. The HOA had apparently claimed ownership months before the bulldozers arrived. That meant they had planned this. I walked through the hallway. Past photographs of my grandfather. Past the old wooden clock he'd given my mother. Then I stopped in front of a cabinet he'd kept locked for years. He always told me the same thing. Never throw away old records. I opened it. Inside were tax receipts. Photographs. Old property documents. And underneath everything, a rolled-up piece of paper. I pulled it out. There was handwriting across the top. My grandfather's handwriting. It said, "Original survey, keep this safe." I stood there staring at those 4 words. Then I slowly unrolled the document across the kitchen table. The survey was decades old. The paper was yellow. The edges were brittle. But the boundary lines were clear. The creek. The oak grove. The eastern field. And the old stone marker near the northern fence. I pulled out the modern development map. Then I compared them. My hand started shaking. The boundaries didn't match. The HOA map had moved the property line hundreds of feet, straight across my family's farm. I immediately called Andrea Voss. She listened carefully. Then she said, "Daniel, don't confront them again." "Why?" "Because if this survey is authentic, they may have a serious problem." "How serious?" She paused. "Serious enough to stop the entire development." The next morning, Andrea arrived with a licensed surveyor named Michael Reeves. We walked the property together. Michael studied the original survey, then the modern development map. Finally, he asked me to take him to the old boundary marker. We walked nearly half a mile. The marker was buried beneath weeds. Michael cleared the vegetation and checked the coordinates. Then he looked at Andrea. Then at me. "This is the original boundary." He checked it again. Every measurement matched the old survey. Michael pointed toward the construction area. "That entire section is inside your property. The bulldozers had been working on land that legally belonged to me." We went straight to the county records office. Andrea requested everything. The original deed, historical surveys, property transfers, tax records, development applications. An hour later, the clerk returned with a thick stack of files. We checked everything. My grandfather had owned the land. My mother had inherited it. And I had inherited it from her. There had never been a sale. There had never been a transfer. There wasn't even an easement. Then we found the developer's purchase agreement. They had purchased the land next to my farm. Not my farm. Andrea looked at me. "Daniel, they don't own it." Then we found the problem. The developer's application included a newer survey. It wasn't the original county survey. Someone had created a new boundary. And that boundary moved the eastern edge of my property. Andrea asked the clerk when it had been filed. The clerk gave us the date. Only months before construction began. I stared at the document. This wasn't an old mistake. Andrea shook her head. No. Someone had created a new survey. Someone had submitted it. And someone had used it to justify bulldozing my family's farm. But we still needed one thing. Proof that the original boundary marker was still where my grandfather had placed it. Michael had an idea. He believed there was another survey monument somewhere beneath an old oak tree. The next morning, we went looking. He measured from the creek. Then from the northern boundary. Then from the old stone marker. Finally, he stopped beside a massive oak. He pushed a metal probe into the ground. It hit something. We started digging. A few inches down, we found stone. Then metal. Michael carefully cleared away the dirt. And there it was. The original survey monument. Still exactly where the old survey said it should be. Michael recorded the coordinates. Andrea photographed the marker from every angle. Then he compared the location with the original survey. It matched perfectly. There was no longer any reasonable argument. The original survey was accurate. The boundary had been moved on the developer's map. And the land the bulldozers were clearing was mine. But then I noticed something. The bulldozers had stopped. I looked toward the construction trailer. Beth Chambers was standing outside. She was watching us. She knew we'd found it. Beth walked toward us. She asked what we were doing. Andrea told her. Verifying the property boundary. Beth looked down at the marker. That marker isn't legally relevant. Michael immediately responded. It matches the original county coordinates exactly. Beth became defensive. She said the developer had relied on approved documents. Andrea asked. Then why was the original boundary moved? Beth didn't answer. Instead, she told me the HOA would fight me in court. I looked at her. Then we'll see what the records say. She walked away. What Beth didn't know was that Andrea had recorded the conversation. That evening, Andrea called me. "Daniel, you need to see this." I drove to her office. She pulled up an email. The subject line read, "Eastern Parcel, Boundary Issue." The developer's attorney had warned them that the original survey could establish my family's ownership. Someone replied, "Proceed with construction. Ownership can be dealt with later." I read it twice. They knew. They knew before the bulldozers arrived. Then Andrea showed me another email. This one was from Beth. She suggested using the HOA's resources to pressure me into accepting a settlement. I stared at the screen. They knew they didn't own it. Andrea nodded. They thought you wouldn't fight. The courtroom was packed. The developer's attorneys were there. The HOA was there. Beth Chambers sat at the front. I sat beside Andrea. Judge Eleanor Marshall entered. Everyone stood. The HOA's attorney argued that the developer had relied on an approved survey. He said the original survey was outdated. He said the developer had acted in good faith. Andrea waited. Then she stood. She placed the original deed on the evidence table. Then the original survey. Then photographs of the buried survey monument. Finally, she displayed the modern development survey. The judge studied the documents. Andrea said, "The defendant's survey moved the property boundary." The courtroom went silent. Andrea brought up the two surveys on a large courtroom display. The original survey appeared first. Then the developer's version. The difference was obvious. The original boundary ran around the eastern field. The new boundary cut directly through it. Andrea pointed toward the screen. "This is where the original property line was." Then she pointed to the developer's survey. "And this is where they moved it." The judge leaned forward. "Who approved the new boundary?" The HOA attorney began answering. But Andrea interrupted. "We have evidence that answers that question." She reached for a folder. Inside was the email. Andrea displayed the email. The courtroom became silent. It showed that the developer knew about the original survey before construction began. They knew the property ownership was disputed. And they chose to build anyway. Then Andrea displayed Beth's email. The judge read it carefully. Finally, she looked toward Beth. "Mrs. Chambers, did you know about the boundary dispute?" Beth hesitated. "Yes." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Andrea presented the GPS coordinates. The county records. The original survey. The tax records. Everything matched. My family had never sold the eastern field. The developer never owned it. The HOA never owned it. Yet they had bulldozed it anyway. The judge looked down at the evidence. Then she said, "I've seen enough." Construction was immediately halted. The developer was ordered to remove the unauthorized structures. The HOA's claims against me were dismissed. And the court ordered an investigation into how the altered survey had been used. Then came the part one never expected. The developer was ordered to restore the damaged portions of my property. The trees. The fencing. The land they had destroyed. It wouldn't bring everything back. But it was a start. Andrea leaned toward me. "It's over." I looked at the original survey. "No," I said quietly. "Now it's finally ours again." Months later, I stood in the eastern field again. The bulldozers were gone. The construction equipment was gone. The HOA signs were gone. Workers had rebuilt the fence. Some of the damaged trees had been replaced. It wasn't exactly the way it had been before. But it was mine again. I walked toward the old oak tree. The same tree where we'd found my grandfather's survey marker. I placed my hand against the trunk. And for a moment, I remembered being a kid. Walking beside my grandfather. Listening to him talk about the land. He used to say, "Take care of it, and it'll take care of you." I finally understood what he meant. I pulled the original survey from its protective folder. I looked at the faded lines. The same lines my grandfather had trusted. The same lines that had survived decades. The same lines that had stopped an entire development. The HOA had bulldozers. The developer had millions of dollars. They had lawyers, influence, and power. My grandfather had an old piece of paper. And it was enough. Because the land wasn't just property. It was family. It was history. And sometimes, the oldest document in the house is more powerful than millions of dollars. The HOA thought they were bulldozing an empty field. They didn't realize they were crossing a boundary my grandfather had marked decades earlier. And they definitely didn't know. I still had the original survey. If you enjoyed this HOA nightmare, make sure you subscribe. Because sometimes the biggest battles aren't about money. They're about family. They're about history. And they're about standing up when someone decides they can simply take what belongs to you. And remember, always keep the original documents. Because you never know when one old piece of paper might be the only thing standing between you and someone else's bulldozer.